This is a basic introduction to After Effects. So if I jump to After Effects, usually this window is the one that pops up. I'll just close that and I'll find that the main window sits behind it. So the first thing I want to point out here is that we have our project window. So this is where you're going to bring files in. Effects, when you add effects, you can kind of control them through here. Down along the bottom we have the timeline, and in here we have composition, and the composition is essentially like creating a new page. If we have a look up at the top menu along here, you've got your normal ones with file, that export, import, edit, cut, copy, paste. Composition, this is where you're going to render things out from. Layer, we'll end up getting into that later. Effects, animation, the main one on here is when it starts talking about keyframes. That's how we use After Effects. And then your basics, view and window. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a new composition. So if I click on that, I'll get this menu. I can give it a name. I'm just going to call it main at the moment. And under here, the preset, I'm going to go to HD TV, and there's one here, the 1080, and it says 25. So when we click on that, this is what we're after, 1920 by 1080, and the frame rate, 25 frames per second. That's what we use in New Zealand. It's kind of the PAL system. And down here we've got duration. So at the moment it has frames, and then it has seconds, minutes, hours. So at the moment it says 10 seconds. So I'll go OK, and it brings up the window. As soon as this comes up, you'll see that everything is activated in the timeline. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in a shape. And I should just point out at this stage that under Layer, New, this is where you have, whether you're bringing in text, you're dealing with a shape, solid camera. This is kind of the setup for the timeline down here. So I'm going to come along here, and the first thing I'm going to go to is the shape. So if I click and hold down, I'm going to pick the ellipse tool. If I shift and drag a shape out here, I get the circle. And the first thing I want to point out is this center point. Everything that happens on here happens from the center point. So if I want to move this, I come up to this tool here, the little dashed dotty square, which is called pan behind. If I click on it, I'm just going to hold down the command key and click off and click on it so that I see it. With the pan behind tool, I'll drag that and place it in the center. So with the timeline, the way that it works is when you bring something up, you're going to end up with it coming in here. We can change the name of it. So if I click on it and I hit return, I can give it a name. Hit return again, and it's going to do it. If I click it open, the main thing you're going to see here is transform. And we've got position, scale, rotation, opacity. So this is the way that you move things within After Effects. So this thing here is called the playhead. This element here, the time ruler, I can move that, and it means that when I play something, it's just going to play within that area. This at the top, the time navigation, it's kind of like zooming in and zooming out. And you've got the same thing down here with the kind of little mountain, big mountain. So just enlarging in on that timeline. So to move this, you can see there's a whole series of stopwatches. So the first thing I need to do is add a keyframe. And to start something, you hit the stopwatch, and you'll see that it comes up with a diamond on the timeline. So now if I move the playhead, I can see up here it's talking about S, so seconds. So I've got it on 1 second. What I can do now is with the arrow tool, I can move this. As soon as I move it, it will add another keyframe. if I drag the time ruler in the work area and I hit the space bar, it's going to play, but it's just playing within that area that I've selected. I can click up here beside the playhead and it'll stop it. And what you'll notice as well is if I go, and if I hold down the shift key, it will snap to these keyframes. So I'm going to go to this keyframe and I'm just going to drag it down. And what you'll notice is there's a point that comes in here and there's another one that comes up here. And what this is, these are the Bezier handles. So if I move them, it's going to curve that path. Click down here, I hit the space bar, and it's going to follow that curve. Now with After Effects you just keep adding things. So if I click in there, so what I can do is I can come here and I can say halfway between those keyframes I'm going to click the opacity to give a keyframe, shift so that it snaps to this next keyframe, and then I'm going to change the opacity down to 0. So if I scrub through it, it's following the path, and when it gets to this point the opacity is going to change down to 0, so it's going to disappear. Hit the spacebar and play it. And essentially this is what we're doing with After Effects, is we're adding these keyframes, putting layer upon layer. So another one, if I want, I can click the scale, and if it's locked it's going to scale everything proportionally, but if I unlock it I can change it. So now if I go 50, hit tab, I'm going to end up with an ellipse. And because it's keyframed, I can change that. So if I go to the end using the shift key to snap, I can change that back to 100. So it's going to go from an ellipse, and you'll see it starts to turn back into a circle. What I can do as well is I can add in rotation. So I can say, okay, there's the rotation there, and as it gets to this point where the opacity starts to change, I'm going to rotate it. And you can see as I turn it, the rotation of the ellipse. And so if I pull it back, you can see that the ellipse starts to rotate, it's following a path, and then when it gets to this point, the opacity is going to start to disappear. And at the same time, the shape is changing to a circle. Play. So all of this is simply layering up and adding things on. In the same way, you can add effects. So if we look at the effects panel here, you'll see there's a number of options, blur and sharpen. So let's go for blur. So if I flick that open, I'm going to end up with a Gaussian blur as well. So I can drag it, I can drop it on my shape, or I can drop it on the timeline. And what you will see is effects will pop open here, and I'll get all the same options. Usually it's easier just to work on it up here in the effects control. So what I'll do is I'll click this open. I can just pull this if I want, like do the numbers that way, or move the slider. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to blur it, and you can see it happening there. I'll bump it right up to the top. So to make this happen, I need to click that stopwatch so that it adds a keyframe. And as I move it across just a little bit, I'm going to take that all the way down to 0. So when it starts off blurry, sharpens up quickly, and all those other assets are still going. Now, if I flick open the effects, I'll see those keyframes. So I can see them there. So now let's play it. So we've got blur, sharpening, opacity, a path, rotation, scale, all these things. So it's just simply building up and building up. If I go to my project, I can see that I've got my composition here. So with this, I can add in another shape. I'll give it a different color. As soon as I draw it, we end up with another timeline coming in. So exactly the same sort of thing again. I can click open the transform. I can pull it back, but in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to work it a bit differently. I'm going to say come here, and then a quick key is if I hold down the option key, if I hit the left square bracket while this is highlighted, it's going to crop it in. If I go Command Z, if I hit option right square bracket, it's going to crop it in. Command Z. I can also shift the timeline a little bit, but you can see, so any of those options, all it's doing is there's nothing, and then it hits the timeline and it appears. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make it appear with the opacity. So I've got my opacity here, so I hit the stopwatch, and in this case what I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom in. And what you'll see now is it talks about frames rather than talking about seconds. So there's 25 frames per second. So you can see this is just a fraction of a second. So what I'm going to do is I've got my opacity 100. I'm going to go 1, 2 frames in, take it down to 0, 1, 2, drag it back up to 100. And these things you can copy as well. So if I select that keyframe and I go Command C to copy it, 1, 2, Command V, and paste it. Now I can grab all of these because I know that ends on 0 and this one's on 100. Command C, copy them, 1, 2, paste. And so now if I play this little bit, it's going to look like a flicker. I'm going to zoom out so I can see everything again. And I'll go back to the start and I'll say, okay, as it flickers, I'm going to change the position as well. So with this one, I'm going to keyframe the position, move it. I need my arrow tool. And see this, because I didn't change the center point, it's working from a different spot. So I need to get my pan behind control and see if I can drag that back into the center. Just makes it a wee bit easier. Now I can move it a little bit, drag it up, move the playhead a bit, drag it down, playhead a little bit more, and drag it up. Now what you'll notice is that with this dragging around, it puts a curve on it. So again, with those bezier handles I can change the curve, but if I want this to be sharp, I'll come up here to the pen tool, I'll get the convert vertex, and if I click on that, it's going to change it to a sharp angle. If I click on it again with the same tool, it brings out the Bezier handles. If I drag one of them, it will just move one. Command Z. So let's play it. So it follows that zigzag while it's flicking on and off. So again, we can add blur, we can do all these sorts of things, and we're just loading up these layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about rendering. So with this program under composition, we're going to use something called Add to Media Encoder. You've got Add to Render Queue, which is the old system. The Media Encoder gives you more options with your codecs or the way you render it out, and it also means that it will render in the background and you can continue using After Effects. So we'll go Add to Media Encoder, and what it's doing now is just opening up the other program. Sometimes it takes a minute for it to pop up here, but when it does, this is the one that we want to use. You can see there's a whole lot of codexes, but H.264 is the one we want to use. Match source just means whatever I had set up in After Effects is going to happen here, and then I just give it a name and where I want to save it to. Go save, and then there's the play button up here. I hit that, and you're going to see it come through down here. You can see it gave you a little preview and it goes through. Now we can open it up and have a look at it in QuickTime. It opens up in QuickTime. I can loop it and I can play it. Now at the moment it's coming through with a black background, so if I wanted to change that, I go back to After Effects, and what I would do is I would go Layer, New, and I'll bring in a solid. And I actually need to put in a white background. I'm just going to change it so I know it's absolutely white, so 255, 255, 255, and now it's white. I'll go OK. You can make comp size, but in general it automatically does that. I go OK. Puts the layer in here, and I'll just drag it down the bottom. So I'm physically giving that white background. I can change the color and give it a different color background if I want. And so now I'll add this to the media encoder. You can see it's, because it's already open, it's jumped up pretty quickly. So everything looks fine. I'll just give it a new name where I want to save it to. Hit play. See, it goes through pretty quickly, and then again I can jump to QuickTime. And now we get the same thing, but this time it's included the white background.